In 1976, Isaac Hayes owned a compound outside Memphis that took up most of a city block. There was a recording studio in the back, a fleet of cars in a custom garage, a wardrobe that filled 2 rooms, and a staff of people whose exact number Hayes himself could not have named off the top of his head. He had furniture flown in from Europe. He had jewelry made to order. He wore gold chains that collectively weighed several pounds, not as a stage costume, but as his actual daily clothing, because by that point, the line between Isaac Hayes the person and Isaac Hayes the character had largely dissolved, and nobody around him was in any position to suggest that was a problem. 3 years later, a federal court in Tennessee declared him bankrupt. The debt was over $6 million. Everything that could be sold was sold. What followed is usually described in a single sentence. Hayes lost his money, rebuilt his career, and survived. But that sentence skips over something worth looking at more carefully, because the bankruptcy was not the most consequential thing that happened to him in those years. What happened after it was. Hayes was born in Covington, Tennessee in 1942. His parents left the picture early. His father when Isaac was still an infant, his mother when he was 18 months old. Cause of death, tuberculosis. He was raised by his maternal grandparents, Russia and Cleonice Wade, on a farm where the work was real and the money was not. He picked cotton. He picked strawberries. He did whatever the season required. And when the season didn't require anything, he went to school, where it turned out he was exceptionally good at music. He could play almost any instrument he encountered by ear, and he had a voice that people noticed the first time they heard it, even when it was just a teenager singing in a church in Shelby County. He moved to Memphis as a young man and fell into the orbit of Stax Records, the soul label operating out of a converted movie theater on McLemore Avenue. At a moment when Stax was becoming one of the most important recording operations in the country, without anyone fully understanding yet that that was what was happening. Hayes started as a session musician, playing keyboards and saxophone on recordings by other people. He was good at this and got better. He watched how records were made and absorbed the logic of the thing. The collaboration that made him famous began more or less by accident. He and David Porter were both working at Stax, both trying to figure out what they were doing, and they started writing songs together in a way that was initially just 2 people seeing what happened when they were in a room. What happened was that they wrote, "Hold on, I'm comin'" in a bathroom stall, according to Porter's own account, when Hayes shouted the phrase through the door as a joke. Sam and Dave recorded it in 1966, and it became a top 10 hit. Then they wrote Soul Man, which was even bigger. Then they wrote When Something Is Wrong With My Baby, I Thank You, and a string of others that placed them among the most reliable hitmakers in American R&B. By the late 1960s, Hayes and Porter had written hundreds of songs. Hayes' own recording career started almost reluctantly. Stax needed product for an album series it was putting together, and Hayes and some musicians went into the studio on a Sunday, essentially improvising, and recorded what became Presenting Isaac Hayes, an album that went nowhere commercially, but that showed something. Hayes could do something unusual with a song. He could stretch it out, slow it down, find the architecture in a melody, and walk around inside it for 12 or 15 minutes while a listener stayed interested. The label wasn't sure what to do with that, but Hayes kept doing it anyway. Hot Buttered Soul, released in 1969, had 4 tracks. The shortest was 12 minutes. The longest was 18. One of them was a reading of Burt Bacharach and Hal David's Walk On By, a song most people knew as a tight 2.5-minute pop single that Hayes transformed into something closer to a meditation. The melody stretched over slow rolling strings and a tempo that refused to be hurried. The album sold over 1 million copies. Nobody had heard anything quite like it, and the fact that it was hard to categorize turned out not to be a commercial liability at all. Over the next 2 years, Hayes released The Isaac Hayes Movement and To Be Continued, both successful, And then, in 1971, he was asked to score a film called Shaft. He wrote the theme, which opened with a guitar riff and built into a full orchestral arrangement over which Hayes spoke, or more than sang, about a private detective named John Shaft in a way that was entirely confident and slightly amused. The song won the Academy Award for Best Original Song in 1972, making Hayes the first black artist to win in that category. He showed up to the ceremony in a fur cape and a vest covered in chains. The image was photographed thousands of times and reproduced in every major magazine and newspaper that covered the event. Whatever his profile had been before, it was different afterward. The money that came with this period of his career was substantial. Hayes spent it at a rate that matched its arrival, and then, as things began to shift, at a rate that exceeded it. The Stax situation changed in the early 1970s in ways that affected everyone at the label. A distribution deal with CBS went wrong, ownership changed hands, and the catalog and financial structure of the company became increasingly complicated. When Stax filed for bankruptcy in 1975, it took with it a significant portion of what Hayes was owed in royalties. He was left with debts, a lifestyle built for a different income level, and a recording situation that no longer had the institutional support it once did. There were tax issues, there were bad investments, there were the ongoing costs of the Memphis compound and everything associated with it, the staff, the cars, the daily expenses of a life that had been built at the peak of a career and that continued regardless of whether the income did. Hayes later spoke about this period in interviews with varying degrees of frankness. He acknowledged that he had not paid close attention to where the money went. He acknowledged that people around him had been paid to manage things and that he had trusted them more than the situation warranted. He said in one interview that he had essentially been legally robbed, though he didn't specify by whom he meant, or whether he meant Stax, or the IRS, or people in his personal orbit, or all of them. The bankruptcy filing came in 1976. The compound was lost, the cars were sold, the recording equipment went. A great deal of the jewelry went, though Hayes held on to some of it, or reacquired pieces later, depending on which account you read. He moved into a much smaller place and, for a period, was, by his own account, genuinely uncertain about what came next. He was 34 years old. What he did next, rather than any single dramatic comeback moment, is the more interesting part of the story. He signed with Polydor Records and kept recording. He had a substantial R&B hit in 1979 with Don't Let Go, which reached #1 on the Billboard R&B chart. He toured. He was a reliable concert draw even when his recording output was inconsistent, because his live show had always been something distinct from the records, a performance that was partly music and partly theater, with Hayes as a figure whose physical presence alone communicated something. The shaved head and the gold and the voice that seemed to have been manufactured specifically to fill large rooms. But the Hollywood part of the story is its own thing. And it's the part that gets treated as a footnote when it deserves more attention than that. Hayes had been acting in films since the early 1970s, mostly in smaller roles. But in 1974, he starred in Truck Turner, an action film in which he played a bail bondsman and bounty hunter who spends most of the movie in various states of violent confrontation. The film was not a prestige production. It was made quickly and cheaply and released to drive-ins and urban theaters as part of the blaxploitation wave that had been running since the success of Shaft. Hayes was, by the standards of the genre, a compelling screen presence. His size and manner translated well to the kind of role that required someone who looked like they could handle whatever the script threw at them. He also scored the film himself, which meant the soundtrack was substantially his. He took other roles in the years that followed, but the pattern that emerged was one that a lot of musicians experienced when they crossed into acting in that era. The work was available, but the work was of a specific type, and the type was not one that led naturally to other kinds of work. Hayes was offered action roles, villain roles, physical roles. He was not offered dramatic roles that required a different kind of register. This was partly a product of the moment. The industry in the 1970s had a set of categories that black actors generally found themselves locked into, regardless of what they were capable of. And partly a product of Hayes's own image, which was so specific and so large that casting him in something small or quiet would have required a director willing to work against the audience's expectations of what Isaac Hayes showing up in your movie meant. After the bankruptcy, the Hollywood opportunities that had been available to him became less available. This was not coincidental. In the entertainment industry of that period, financial collapse was treated as a signal that went beyond the financial. If you had lost control of your money, the reasoning went, you had lost control of something essential, and that made you a risk. Hayes found himself on the other side of that perception, and the calls that had come regularly started coming less regularly, and then not regularly at all. He did not pursue Hollywood aggressively after that point. This is worth noting because it would have been natural to try. The exposure that came with film roles was the kind of thing that kept a performer's name in circulation during periods when the recording side was quiet. But Hayes's relationship with the industry seems to have shifted after the bankruptcy into something more ambivalent. He had seen how quickly the structures that supported a career could collapse, and the specific way that the film industry had treated him, offering a certain kind of role and not another, then withdrawing even that offer when his circumstances changed, does not appear to have inspired loyalty. Instead, he shifted his energy into other things. He did television. He did radio. He spent years as a disc jockey in New York on WBLS, which was a significant station in the R&B and soul world, and he was good at it in a way that suggests he had thought about what radio could do that other mediums couldn't. He was accessible in a way that his Hayes's stage persona wasn't always. The radio version of him was discursive, interested in the music, willing to talk about things other than himself. People who worked with him in that period describe a man who was engaged with the medium on its own terms rather than treating it as a step toward something else. He moved to Atlanta in the 1980s. He was still recording, still touring, and still generating income, though at a level far below the peak. He had remarried. His personal life had been consistently complicated, with multiple marriages and a large number of children, and the financial pressure of the late 1970s had not improved the domestic situation, and he had restructured his life around a scale that was manageable. There is a version of this story that frames what happened after the bankruptcy as a slow decline, a career that never recovered what it lost. That version has some truth in it, in the narrow sense that Hayes never had another Shaft, never had another Hot Buttered Soul, never returned to the position he occupied in 1972. But it's a version that measures everything against the peak and finds everything else insufficient, which is one way to look at a life and not the most useful one. The more accurate version is that Hayes rebuilt something after 1976 that was structurally different from what came before, and did it without the institutional support, the label infrastructure, and the surrounding boom in soul music that had carried the first version of his career. He built it on live performance, on radio, on television appearances, on smaller recording deals, on maintaining a presence that kept his name known to an audience that had grown up with his music. In 1993, the Stax catalog was reissued and introduced Hayes to a new generation. In 1997, South Park cast him as Chef, the cafeteria cook and occasional sage of the animated series. The role ran for 10 seasons. It introduced Hayes to an audience that had no memory of Shaft and knew his voice primarily as the man who sang the Chocolate Salty Balls song. This was, depending on your perspective, either a slight come-down or an impressive piece of cultural longevity. The ability to remain relevant to a 20-year-old in 1997 when you had won an Academy Award in 1972 is not something most performers manage. he left South Park in 2006 after an episode mocking Scientology aired, citing a personal objection based on his membership in the church. The circumstances around his departure became more complicated when it emerged that he had suffered a stroke in January 2006 and that some people close to him disputed whether he had been in a position to make the decision to leave on his own terms. Hayes himself did not speak extensively about this publicly. The question of what he actually wanted in the last years of his life is one that his family and his associates disagree about, and the record is genuinely unclear. He died on August 10, 2008 at his home in Memphis, having been found unconscious near a treadmill. He was 65. The bankruptcy in 1976 was real, and it was severe, and it ended a particular version of his life permanently. But what it didn't do was end Hayes himself. He continued for another 32 years after the moment when the compound was lost and the cars were sold, and the federal court put its stamp on the wreckage of his finances. Those 32 years included bad periods and good ones. A second cultural moment with South Park that few people would have predicted. Years of work as a radio personality that didn't make the newspapers, but that apparently satisfied him. And the persistent loyalty of an audience that had decided, sometime in the late 1960s, that his voice was one they wanted to keep hearing. The gold chains came back eventually, not all of them probably, but enough that the image remained intact. Hayes understood, at some level, that the image was part of what he was selling, that the shaved head and the chains and the particular delivery weren't separate from the music. They were the context the music existed in, the visual claim that what you were about to hear was going to be something. He kept making that claim long after the machinery that had amplified it originally was gone. What he walked away from in the years after the bankruptcy wasn't Hollywood exactly, and it wasn't ambition. It was something more like the belief that the industry structures were going to take care of him if he showed up and performed. He had seen what happened when you trusted those structures too completely. The lesson he seemed to take from it wasn't bitterness, or at least not only bitterness. It was something more practical. The career he could control was the one built on what he could do in a room with an audience, night after night, in whatever city would have him. That career turned out to be durable. In a way, the first one wasn't. It just didn't come with a compound in Memphis.